The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life by Émile Durkheim. Book 3, The Principal Ritual Attitudes. Part 1, The Negative Cult and its Functions, the Ascetic Rites. We do not have the intention of attempting a complete description of the primitive cult in what is to follow. Being preoccupied especially with reaching that which is most elementary and most fundamental in the religious life, we shall not attempt to reconstruct in detail the frequently confused multiplicity of all the ritual forms. But out of the midst of this extreme diversity of practices, we should like to touch upon the most characteristic attitudes which the primitive observes in the celebration of his cult, to classify the most general forms of his rites, and to determine their origins and significance, in order that we may control and, if there is occasion, make more definite the results to which the analysis of the beliefs has led us. Every cult presents a double aspect, one negative, the other positive. In reality, of course, the two sorts of rites which we denominate thus are closely associated. We shall see that they suppose one another. But still, they are different, and, if it is only to understand their connection, it is necessary to distinguish them. By definition, sacred beings are separated beings. That which characterizes them is that there is a break of continuity between them and the profane beings. Normally, the first are outside the others. A whole group of rites has the object of realizing the state of separation which is essential. Since their function is to prevent undue mixings and to keep one of these two domains from encroaching upon the other, they are only able to impose abstentions or negative acts. Therefore, we propose to give the name negative cult to the system formed by these special rites. They do not prescribe certain acts to the faithful, but confine themselves to forbidding certain ways of acting, so they all take the form of interdictions, or, as is commonly said by ethnographers, of taboos. This latter word is the one used in the Polynesian languages to designate the institution in virtue of which certain things are withdrawn from common use. It is also an adjective expressing the distinctive characteristic of these kinds of things. We have already had occasion to show how hard it is to translate a strictly local and dialectical expression like this into a generic term. There is no religion where there are no interdictions and where they do not play a considerable part, so it is regrettable that the consecrated terminology should seem to make so universal an institution into a peculiarity of Polynesia. The expression interdicts or interdiction seems to us to be much more preferable. However, the word taboo, like the word totem, is so customary that it would show an excess of purism to prohibit it systematically. Also, the inconveniences it may have are attenuated when its real meaning and importance have once been definitely stated. But there are interdictions of different sorts which it is important to distinguish, for we shall not have to treat all kinds of interdictions in this chapter. First of all, beside those coming from religion, there are others which are due to magic. The two have this in common, that they declare certain things incompatible, and prescribe the separation of the things whose incompatibility is thus proclaimed. But there are also very grave differences between them. In the first place, the sanctions are not the same in the two cases. Of course, the violation of the religious interdicts is frequently believed, as we shall presently see, to bring about material disorders mechanically, from which the guilty man will suffer, and which are regarded as a judgment on his act. But even if these really come about, this spontaneous and automatic judgment is not the only one, it is always completed by another one, supposing human intervention. A real punishment is added to this, if it does not anticipate it, and this one is deliberately inflicted by men, or at least there is a blame and public reprobation. Even when the sacrilege has been punished, as it were, by the sickness or natural death of its author, it is also defamed, it offends opinion, which reacts against it, it puts the man who did it in fault. On the contrary, the magic interdiction is judged only by the material consequences which the forbidden act is believed to produce, with a sort of physical necessity. In disobeying, a man runs risks similar to those to which an invalid exposes himself in not following the advice of his physician, but in this case disobedience is not a fault, it creates no indignation. There is no sin in magic. Moreover, this difference in sanction is due to a profound difference in the nature of the interdictions. The religious interdiction necessarily implies the notion of sacredness, it comes from the respect inspired by the sacred object, and its purpose is to keep this respect from failing. On the other hand, the interdictions of magic suppose only a wholly lay notion of property. The things which the magician recommends to be kept separate are those which, by reason of their characteristic properties, cannot be brought together and confused without danger. Even if he happens to ask his clients to keep at a distance from certain sacred things, it is not through respect for them and fear that they may be profaned, for, as we know, magic lives on profanations, it is merely for reasons of temporal utility. In a word, religious interdictions are categorical imperatives, others are useful maxims, the first form of hygienic and medical interdictions. We cannot study two orders of facts as different as these simultaneously, or even under the same name, without confusion. We are only concerned with the religious interdictions here. But a new distinction is necessary between these latter. There are religious interdictions whose object is to separate two sacred things of different species from each other. For example, it will be remembered that among the Wackelbearer the scaffold upon which the corpse is exposed must be made exclusively of materials belonging to the phratry of the dead man. This is as much as to say that all contact between the corpse, which is sacred, and the things of the other phratry, which are also sacred, but differently, is forbidden. Elsewhere, the arms which one uses to hunt an animal with cannot be made out of a kind of wood that is classed in the same social group as the animal itself. But the most important of these interdictions are the ones which we shall study in the next chapter. They are intended to prevent all communication between the purely sacred and the impurely sacred, between the sacredly auspicious and the sacredly inauspicious. All these interdictions have one common characteristic: they come, not from the fact that some things are sacred while others are not, but from the fact that there are inequalities and incompatibilities between sacred things. So they do not touch what is essential in the idea of sacredness. The observance of these prohibitions can give place only to isolated rites which are particular and almost exceptional, but it could not make a real cult, for before all, a cult is made by regular relations between the profane and the sacred as such. But there is another system of religious interdictions which is much more extended and important. This is the one which separates, not different species of sacred things, but all that is sacred from all that is profane. So it is derived immediately from the notion of sacredness itself, and it limits itself to expressing and realizing this. Thus it furnishes the material for a veritable cult, and even of a cult which is at the basis of all the others, for the attitude which it prescribes is one from which the worshipper must never depart in all his relations with the sacred. It is what we call the negative cult. We may say that its interdicts are the religious interdicts par excellence. It is only these that we shall discuss in the following pages. But they take multiple forms. Here are the principal ones which we observe in Australia. Before all are the interdictions of contact. These are the original taboos, of which the others are scarcely more than particular varieties. They rest upon the principle that the profane should never touch the sacred. We have seen already that the uninitiated may not touch the chewinga or the bull roarers under any circumstances. If adults are allowed the free use of them, it is because initiation has conferred a sacred character upon them. Blood, and especially that which flows during the initiation, has a religious virtue. It is under the same interdict. It is the same with the hair. A dead man is sacred because the soul which animated the body stays with the corpse. For this reason it is sometimes forbidden to carry the bones of a dead man about unless they are wrapped up in a piece of bark. Even the place where the death took place should be avoided, for they believe that the soul of the dead man continues to haunt the spot. That is why they break camp and move some distance away. In certain cases they destroy it along with everything it contains, and a certain time must elapse before they can come back to the same place. Thus it comes about that a dying man creates an empty space about him. They abandon him after they have installed him as comfortably as possible. An exceptionally intimate contact is the one resulting from the absorption of food. Hence comes the interdiction against eating the sacred animals or vegetables, and especially those serving as totems. Such an act appears so very sacrilegious that the prohibition covers even adults, or at least, the majority of them. Only the old men attain a sufficient religious dignity to escape this interdict sometimes. This prohibition has sometimes been explained by the mythical kinship uniting the man to the animals whose name he bears. They are protected by the sentiment of sympathy which they inspire by their position as kin. But the fact that the consumption of the forbidden flesh is believed to cause sickness or death automatically shows that this interdiction does not have its origin in the simple revolt of the feeling of domestic relationship. Forces of another sort are in action which are analogous to those in all religions and which are believed to react against sacrileges. Moreover, if certain foods are forbidden to the profane because they are sacred, certain others, on the contrary, are forbidden to persons of a sacred character, because they are profane. Thus it frequently happens that certain animals are specially designated as the food of women. For this reason, they believe that they partake of a feminine nature and that they are consequently profane. On the other hand, the young initiate is submitted to a series of rites of particular severity, to give him the virtues which will enable him to enter into the world of sacred things, from which he had up till then been excluded. They center an exceptionally powerful group of religious forces upon him. Thus he enters into a state of sanctity which keeps all that is profane at a distance. Then he is not allowed to eat the game which is regarded as the special food of women. But contact may be established by other means than the touch. One comes into relations with a thing by merely regarding it. A look is a means of contact. This is why the sight of sacred things is forbidden to the profane in certain cases. A woman should never see the instruments of the cult. The most that is permitted her is to catch a glimpse of them from afar. It is the same with the totemic paintings executed on the bodies of the officiants in the exceptionally important ceremonies. The exceptional solemnity of the rites of initiation prevents the women in certain tribes from seeing the place where they were celebrated or even the neophyte himself. The sacred character which is immanent in the ceremony as a whole is naturally found in the persons of those who directed it or took some part in it. The result of this is that the novice may not raise his eyes to them, and this interdiction continues even after the rite is accomplished. A dead man is also removed from view sometimes. His face is covered over in such a way that it cannot be seen. The word is another way of entering into relations with persons or things. The breath expired establishes a communication. This is a part of us which spreads outwards. Thus it is forbidden to the profane to address the sacred beings or simply to speak in their presence. Just as the neophyte must not regard either the operators or the assistants, so it is forbidden to him to converse with them except by signs, and this interdiction keeps the place to which it has been raised, by means of a special rite. In a general way, there are, among the Arunta, moments in the course of the great ceremonies when silence is obligatory. As soon as the Chlinga are exposed, every one keeps still, or if someone talks, he does so in a low voice or with his lips only. Besides the sacred things, there are words and sounds which have the same character. They should not pass the lips of the profane or enter their ears. There are ritual songs which women must not hear under pain of death. They may hear the noise of the bull roarers, but only from a distance. Every proper name is considered an essential element of the person who bears it, being closely associated in the mind to the idea of this person. It participates in the sentiments which this latter inspires. So if the one is sacred, the other is. Therefore, it may not be pronounced in the course of the profane life. Among the Warramunga there is one totem which is particularly venerated. This is the snake called Wal Unkwa. Its name is taboo. It is the same with Biami, Daramulun, and Bunjil. The esoteric form of their name must not be revealed to the uninitiate. During mourning, the name of the dead man must not be mentioned, at least by his parents, except when there is an absolute necessity, and even in this case it must be whispered. This interdiction is frequently perpetual for the widow and certain relatives. Among certain peoples, this even extends beyond the family. All the individuals whose name is the same as that of the dead man must change theirs temporarily. But there is more than this. The relatives and intimate friends sometimes abstain from certain words in the usual language, undoubtedly because they were employed by the dead man. These gaps are filled in by means of periphrases or words taken from some foreign dialects. In addition to their public and everyday names, all men have another which is kept a secret. The women and children do not know it. It is never used in the ordinary life. This is because it has a religious character. There are even ceremonies during which it is necessary to speak a special language which must not be used for profane purposes. It is the beginning of a sacred language. Not only are the sacred beings separated from the profane, but also nothing which either directly or indirectly concerns the profane life should be confused with the religious life. Complete nudity is frequently demanded of the native as a prerequisite to being admitted to participation in the rites. He is required to strip himself of all his habitual ornaments, even those to which he is the most attached, and from which he separates himself the least willingly because of the protecting virtues he attributes to them. If he is obliged to decorate himself to play his part in the ritual, this decoration has to be made specially for the occasion. It is a ceremonial costume, a gala dress. As these ornaments are sacred, owing to the use made of them, he is forbidden to use them in profane affairs. When the ceremony is finished, they are buried or burnt. The men must even wash themselves in such a way as to carry away with them no trace of the decorations with which they were adorned. In general, all acts characteristic of the ordinary life are forbidden while those of the religious life are taking place. The act of eating is, of itself, profane, for it takes place every day. It satisfies essentially utilitarian and material needs, and it is a part of our ordinary existence. This is why it is prohibited in religious times. When one totemic group has loaned its chunga to a foreign clan, it is an exceptionally solemn moment when they are brought back and put into the Erdnachulunga. All those who take part in the ceremony must fast as long as it lasts, and it lasts a long time. The same rule is observed during the rites, of which we shall speak in the next chapter, as well as at certain moments of the initiation. For this same reason, all temporal occupations are suspended while the great religious solemnities are taking place. According to a remark of Spencer and Gillen, which we have already had occasion to cite, the life of the Australian is divided into two very distinct parts. The one is devoted to hunting, fishing and warfare, the other is consecrated to the cult, and these two forms of activity mutually exclude and repel one another. It is on this principle that the universal institution of religious days of rest reposes. The distinctive character of the feast days in all known religions is the cessation of work and the suspension of public and private life, in so far as it does not have a religious objective. This repose is not merely a sort of temporary relaxation which men have given themselves in order to give themselves up more freely to the sentiments of joy ordinarily awakened by the feast days, for they are sad feasts, consecrated to mourning and repentance, and during which the cessation is no less obligatory. This is because work is an eminent form of profane activity. It has no other apparent end than to provide for the temporal necessities of life. It puts us in relations with ordinary things only. On feast days, on the contrary, the religious life attains an exceptional degree of intensity. So the contrast between the two forms of existence is especially marked at this moment. Consequently, they cannot remain near to each other. A man cannot approach his God intimately while he still bears on him marks of his profane life. Inversely, he cannot return to his usual occupations when a rite has just sanctified him. So the ritual day of rest is only one particular case of the general incompatibility separating the sacred from the profane. It is the result of an interdiction. It would be impossible to enumerate here all the different interdictions which have been observed, even in the Australian religions alone. Like the notion of sacredness upon which it rests, the system of interdicts extends into the most diverse relations. It is even used deliberately for utilitarian ends. But howsoever complex it may be, it finally rests upon two fundamental interdictions, which summarize it and dominate it. In the first place, the religious life and the profane life cannot coexist in the same place. If the former is to develop, a special spot must be placed at its disposition, from which the second is excluded. Hence comes the founding of temples and sanctuaries. These are the spots awarded to sacred beings and things and serve them as residences, for they cannot establish themselves in any place except on the condition of entirely appropriating to themselves all within a certain distance. Such arrangements are so indispensable to all religious life that even the most inferior religions cannot do without them. The Erdnachulunga, the spot where the Chlinga are deposited, is a veritable sanctuary. So the uninitiated are not allowed to approach it. It is even forbidden to carry on any profane occupation whatsoever there. As we shall presently see, there are other holy places where important ceremonies are celebrated. Likewise, the religious life and the profane life cannot coexist in the same unit of time. It is necessary to assign determined days or periods to the first, from which all profane occupations are excluded. Thus feast days are born. There is no religion, and, consequently, no society which has not known and practiced this division of time into two distinct parts, alternating with one another according to a law varying with the peoples and the civilizations. As we have already pointed out, it was probably the necessity of this alternation which led men to introduce into the continuity and homogeneity of duration, certain distinctions and differentiations which it does not naturally have. Of course, it is almost impossible that the religious life should ever succeed in concentrating itself hermetically in the places and times which are thus attributed to it. It is inevitable that a little of it should filter out. There are always some sacred things outside the sanctuaries. There are some rites that can be celebrated on workdays. But these are sacred things of the second rank and rites of a lesser importance. Concentration remains the dominating characteristic of this organization. Generally, this concentration is complete for all that concerns the public cult, which cannot be celebrated except in common. The individual, private cult is the only one which comes very near to the temporal life. Thus the contrast between these two successive phases of human life attains its maximum of intensity in the inferior societies, for it is there that the individual cult is the most rudimentary. Up to the present, the negative cult has been presented to us only as a system of abstentions. So it seems to serve only to inhibit activity, and not to stimulate it or to modify it. And yet, as an unexpected reaction to this inhibitive effect, it is found to exercise a positive action of the highest importance over the religious and moral nature of the individual. In fact, owing to the barrier which separates the sacred from the profane, a man cannot enter into intimate relations with sacred things except after ridding himself of all that is profane in him. He cannot lead a religious life of even a slight intensity unless he commences by withdrawing more or less completely from the temporal life. So the negative cult is in one sense a means in view of an end, it is a condition of access to the positive cult. It does not confine itself to protecting sacred beings from vulgar contact, it acts upon the worshipper himself and modifies his condition positively. The man who has submitted himself to its prescribed interdictions is not the same afterwards as he was before. Before, he was an ordinary being who, for this reason, had to keep at a distance from the religious forces. Afterwards, he is on a more equal footing with them, he has approached the sacred by the very act of leaving the profane, he has purified and sanctified himself by the very act of detaching himself from the base and trivial matters that debased his nature. So the negative rites confer efficient powers just as well as the positive ones. The first, like the second, can serve to elevate the religious tone of the individual. According to a very true remark which has been made, no one can engage in a religious ceremony of any importance without first submitting himself to a sort of preliminary initiation which introduces him progressively into the sacred world. Unctions, lust rations, benedictions, or any essentially positive operation may be used for this purpose, but the same result may be attained by means of fasts and vigils or retreat and silence, that is to say, by ritual abstinences, which are nothing more than certain interdictions put into practice. When there are only particular and isolated negative rites, their positive action is generally too slight to be easily perceptible. But there are circumstances when a whole system of interdictions is concentrated on one man. In these cases, their effects accumulate, and thus become more manifest. This takes place in Australia at the time of the initiation. The neophyte is submitted to a great variety of negative rites. He must withdraw from the society in which his existence has been passed up till then, and from almost all human society. Not only is it forbidden for him to see women and uninitiated persons, but he also goes to live in the brush, far from his fellows, under the direction of some old men who serve him as godfathers. So very true is it that the forest is considered his natural environment, that in a certain number of tribes, the word with which the initiation is designated signifies that which is from the forest. For this same reason, he is frequently decorated with leaves during the ceremonies at which he assists. In this way he passes long months, interspersed from time to time with rites in which he must take a part. This time is a period of all sorts of abstinences for him. A multitude of foods are forbidden him. He is allowed only that quantity of food which is absolutely indispensable for the maintenance of life. He is even sometimes bound to a rigorous fast, or must eat impure foods. When he eats, he must not touch the food with his hands. His godfathers put it into his mouth for him. In some cases, he must go to beg his food. Likewise, he sleeps only as much as is indispensable. He must abstain from talking, to the extent of not uttering a word. It is by signs that he makes known his needs. He must not wash, sometimes he must not move. He remains stretched out upon the earth, immobile and without clothing of any sort. Now the result of the numerous interdictions is to bring about a radical change of condition in the initiate. Before the initiation, he lived with the women, he was excluded from the cult. After it, he is admitted to the society of men, he takes part in the rites, and has acquired a sacred character. The metamorphosis is so complete that it is sometimes represented as a second birth. They imagine that the profane person, who was the young man up till then, has died, that he has been killed and carried away by the god of the initiation, Bunjil, Bayami, or Daramalun, and that quite another individual has taken the place of the one that no longer is. So here we find the very heart of the positive effects of which negative rites are capable. Of course we do not mean to say that these latter produce this great transformation all by themselves, but they certainly contributed to it, and largely. In the light of these facts, we are able to understand what asceticism is, what place it occupies in the religious life, and whence come the virtues which have generally been attributed to it. In fact, there is no interdict, the observance of which does not have an ascetic character to a certain degree. Abstaining from something which may be useful or from a form of activity which, since it is usual, should answer to some human need, is, of necessity, imposing constraints and renunciations. So in order to have real asceticism, it is sufficient for these practices to develop in such a way as to become the basis of a veritable scheme of life. Normally, the negative cult serves only as an introduction and preparation for the positive cult. But it sometimes happens that it frees itself from this subordination and passes to the first place, and that the system of interdicts swells and exaggerates itself to the point of usurping the entire existence. Thus a systematic asceticism is born, which is consequently nothing more than a hypertrophy of the negative cult. The special virtues which it is believed to confer are only an amplified form of those conferred, to a lesser degree, by the practice of any interdiction. They have the same origin, for they both rest on the principle that a man sanctifies himself only by efforts made to separate himself from the profane. The pure ascetic is a man who raises himself above men and acquires a special sanctity by fasts and vigils, by retreat and silence, or in a word, by privations, rather than by acts of positive piety, offerings, sacrifices, prayers, etc. History shows to what a high religious prestige one may attain by this method, the Buddhist saint is essentially an ascetic, and he is equal or superior to the gods. It follows that asceticism is not a rare, exceptional, and nearly abnormal fruit of the religious life, as some have supposed it to be. On the contrary, it is one of its essential elements. Every religion contains it, at least in germ, for there are none in which a system of interdicts is not found. Their only difference in this regard which there may be between cults is that this germ is more or less developed in different ones. It should also be added that there probably is not a single one in which this development does not take, at least temporarily, the characteristic traits of real asceticism. This is what generally takes place at certain critical periods when, for a relatively short time, it is necessary to bring about a grave change of condition in a subject. Then, in order to introduce him more rapidly into the circle of sacred things with which he must be put in contact, he is separated violently from the profane world, but this does not come without many abstinences and an exceptional recrudescence of the system of interdicts. Now this is just what happens in Australia at the moment of initiation. In order to transform youths into men, it is necessary to make them live the life of a veritable ascetic. Mrs. Parker very justly calls them the monks of Byami. But abstinences and privations do not come without suffering. We hold to the profane world by all the fibers of our flesh, our senses attach us to it, our life depends upon it. It is not merely the natural theater of our activity, it penetrates us from every side, it is a part of ourselves. So we cannot detach ourselves from it without doing violence to our nature and without painfully wounding our instincts. In other words, the negative cult cannot develop without causing suffering. Pain is one of its necessary conditions. Some have been led to think of it as constituting a sort of right in itself. They have seen in it a state of grace which is to be sought and aroused, even artificially, because of the powers and privileges which it confers in the same way as these systems of interdicts, of which it is the natural accompaniment. So far as we know, Proust is the first who has realized the religious role which is attributed to suffering in the inferior societies. He cites the case of the Arapahes who inflict veritable torments upon themselves in order to become immune from the dangers of battle, of the Big Belly Indians who submit to actual tortures on the eve of military expeditions, of the Hupa who swim in icy rivers and then remain stretched out on the bank as long as possible, in order to assure themselves of success in their enterprises, of the Kareya who from time to time draw blood from their arms and legs by means of scratches made out of the teeth of fish, in order to strengthen their muscles, of the men of Dalmanhaven, Emperor William's land in New Guinea, who combat the sterility of their women by making bloody incisions in the upper part of their thighs. But similar facts may be found without leaving Australia, especially in the course of the initiation ceremonies. Many of the rites practiced on this occasion consist in systematically inflicting certain pains on the neophyte in order to modify his condition and to make him acquire the qualities characteristic of a man. Thus, among the Larikia, while the young men are in retreat in the forest, their godfathers and guardians give them violent blows at any instant, without warning and without cause. Among the Urabana, at a certain time, the novice is stretched out on the ground, his face against the earth. All the men present beat him rudely, then they make 4 or 8 gashes on his back, arranged on each side of the dorsal spine and one on the meridional line of the nape of his neck. Among the Arunta, the first rite of the initiation consists in tossing the subject in a blanket. The men throw him into the air and catch him when he comes down, to throw him up again. In the same tribe, at the close of this long series of ceremonies, the young man lies down on a bed of leaves under which they have placed live coals. He remains there, immobile in the midst of the heat and suffocating smoke. A similar rite is observed among the Urabana, but in addition, while the patient is in this painful situation, they beat him on the back. In a general way, all the exercises to which he is submitted have this same character to such an extent that when he is allowed to re-enter the ordinary life, he has a pitiful aspect and appears half stupefied. It is true that all these practices are frequently represented as ordeals destined to prove the value of the neophyte and to show whether he is worthy of being admitted into the religious society or not. But in reality, the probational function of the rite is only another aspect of its efficacy. For the fact that it has been undergone is proved by its producing its effect, that is to say, by its conferring the qualities which are the original reason for its existence. In other cases, these ritual cruelties are executed, not on the organism as a whole, but on a particular organ or tissue, whose vitality it is their object to stimulate. Thus, among the Arunta, the Warramunga and many other tribes, at a certain moment in the initiation, certain persons are charged with biting the novice severely in the scalp. This operation is so painful that the patient can hardly support it without uttering cries. Its object is to make the hair grow. The same treatment is applied to make the beard grow. The rite of pulling out hairs, which how it mentions in other tribes, seems to have the same reason for existence. According to Ilman, the men and women of the Arunta and the Kadish make small wounds on their arms with sticks red with fire, in order to become skillful in making fire or to acquire the strength necessary for carrying heavy loads of wood. According to this same observer, the Warramunga girls amputate the second and third joints of the index finger on one hand, thinking that the finger thus becomes better fitted for finding yams. It is not impossible that the extraction of teeth was sometimes destined to produce effects of this sort. In any case, it is certain that the cruel rites of circumcision and subincision have the object of conferring particular powers on the genital organs. In fact, the young man is not allowed to marry until after he has undergone them, so he owes them special virtues. What makes this initiation sui generis indispensable is that in all inferior societies, the union of the sexes is marked with a religious character. It is believed to put redoubtable forces into play which a man cannot approach without danger, until after he has acquired the necessary immunity, by ritual processes. For this, a whole series of positive and negative practices is used, of which circumcision and subincision are the forerunners. By painfully mutilating an organ, a sacred character is given to it, since by that act, it is put into shape for resisting the equally sacred forces which it could not meet otherwise. At the beginning of this work, we said that all the essential elements of religious thought and life ought to be found, at least in germ, in the most primitive religions. The preceding facts confirm this assertion. If there is any one belief which is believed to be peculiar to the most recent and idealistic religions, it is the one attributing a sanctifying power to sorrow. Now this same belief is at the basis of the rites which have just been observed. Of course, it is understood differently at the different moments of history when it is studied. For the Christian, it acts especially upon the soul, it purges it, ennobles it, spiritualizes it. For the Australian, it is the body over which it is efficient, it increases its vital energies, it makes its beard and hair grow, it toughens its members. But in both cases the principle is the same. In both it is admitted that suffering creates exceptional strength. And this belief is not without foundation. In fact, it is by the way in which he braves suffering that the greatness of a man is best manifested. He never rises above himself with more brilliancy than when he subdues his own nature to the point of making it follow a way contrary to the one it would spontaneously take. By this, he distinguishes himself from all the other creatures who follow blindly wherever pleasure calls them. By this, he makes a place apart for himself in the world. Suffering is the sign that certain of the bonds attaching him to his profane environment are broken, so it testifies that he is partially freed from this environment, and, consequently, it is justly considered the instrument of deliverance. So he who is thus delivered is not the victim of a pure illusion when he believes himself invested with a sort of mastery over things. He really has raised himself above them, by the very act of renouncing them. He is stronger than nature, because he makes it subside. Moreover, it is by no means true that this virtue has only an aesthetic value. The whole religious life supposes it. Sacrifices and privations do not come without privations which cost the worshipper dear. Even if the rites do not demand material gifts from him, they require his time and his strength. In order to serve his gods, he must forget himself, to make for them a fitting place in his own life. He must sacrifice his profane interests. The positive cult is possible only when a man is trained to renouncement, to abnegation, to detachment from self, and consequently to suffering. It is necessary that he have no dread of them. He cannot even fulfill his duties joyfully unless he loves them to some extent. But for that, it is necessary that he train himself, and it is to this that the ascetic practices tend. So the suffering which they impose is not arbitrary and sterile cruelty, it is a necessary school, where men form and temper themselves, and acquire the qualities of disinterestedness and endurance without which there would be no religion. If this result is to be obtained, it is even a good thing that the ascetic ideal be incarnated eminently in certain persons, whose speciality, so to speak, it is to represent, almost with excess, this aspect of the ritual life, for they are like so many living models, inciting to effort. Such is the historic role of the great ascetics. When their deeds and acts are analyzed in detail, one asks himself what useful end they can have. He is struck by the fact that there is something excessive in the disdain they profess for all that ordinarily impassions men. But these exaggerations are necessary to sustain among the believers a sufficient disgust for an easy life and common pleasures. It is necessary that an elite put the end too high, if the crowd is not to put it too low. It is necessary that some exaggerate, if the average is to remain at a fitting level. But asceticism does not serve religious ends only. Here, as elsewhere, religious interests are only the symbolic form of social and moral interests. The ideal beings to whom the cults are addressed are not the only ones who demand of their followers a certain disdain for suffering. Society itself is possible only at this price. Though exalting the strength of man, it is frequently rude to individuals, it necessarily demands perpetual sacrifices from them, it is constantly doing violence to our natural appetites, just because it raises us above ourselves. If we are going to fulfill our duties towards it, then we must be prepared to do violence to our instincts sometimes and to ascend the decline of nature when it is necessary. So there is an asceticism which, being inherent in all social life, is destined to survive all the mythologies and all the dogmas. It is an integral part of all human culture. At bottom, this is the asceticism which is the reason for the existence of and the justification of that which has been taught by the religions of all times. Having determined what the system of interdicts consists in and what its positive and negative functions are, we must now seek the causes which have given it birth. In one sense, it is logically implied in the very notion of sacredness. All that is sacred is the object of respect, and every sentiment of respect is translated, in him who feels it, by movements of inhibition. In fact, a respected being is always expressed in the consciousness by a representation which, owing to the emotion it inspires, is charged with a high mental energy. Consequently, it is armed in such a way as to reject to a distance every other representation which denies it in whole or in part. Now the sacred world and the profane world are antagonistic to each other. They correspond to two forms of life which mutually exclude one another, or which at least cannot be lived at the same time with the same intensity. We cannot give ourselves up entirely to the ideal beings to whom the cult is addressed and also to ourselves and our own interests at the same time. We cannot devote ourselves entirely to the group and entirely to our own egoism at once. Here there are two systems of conscious states which are directed and which direct our conduct towards opposite poles. So the one having the greater power of action should tend to exclude the other from the consciousness. When we think of holy things, the idea of a profane object cannot enter the mind without encountering grave resistance. Something within us opposes itself to its installation. This is because the representation of a sacred thing does not tolerate neighbors. But this psychic antagonism and this mutual exclusion of ideas should naturally result in the exclusion of the corresponding things. If the ideas are not to coexist, the things must not touch each other or have any sort of relations. This is the very principle of the interdict. Moreover, the world of sacred things is, by definition, a world apart. Since it is opposed to the profane world by all the characteristics we have mentioned, it must be treated in its own peculiar way. It would be a misunderstanding of its nature and a confusion of it with something that it is not, to make use of the gestures, language, and attitudes which we employ in our relations with ordinary things, when we have to do with the things that compose it. We may handle the former freely, we speak freely to vulgar beings, so we do not touch the sacred beings, or we touch them only with reserve, we do not speak in their presence, or we do not speak the common language there. All that is used in our commerce with the one must be excluded from our commerce with the other. But if this explanation is not inexact, it is, nevertheless, insufficient. In fact, there are many beings which are the objects of respect without being protected by systems of rigorous interdictions such as those we have just described. Of course, there is a general tendency of the mind to localize different things in different places, especially when they are incompatible with each other. But the profane environment and the sacred one are not merely distinct, but they are also close to one another, between them there is an abyss. So there ought to be some particular reason in the nature of sacred things, which causes this exceptional isolation and mutual exclusion. And, in fact, by a sort of contradiction, the sacred world is inclined, as it were, to spread itself into the same profane world which it excludes elsewhere. At the same time that it repels it, it tends to flow into it as soon as it approaches. This is why it is necessary to keep them at a distance from one another and to create a sort of vacuum between them. What makes these precautions necessary is the extraordinary contagiousness of a sacred character. Far from being attached to the things which are marked with it, it is endowed with a sort of elusiveness. Even the most superficial or roundabout contact is sufficient to enable it to spread from one object to another. Religious forces are represented in the mind in such a way that they always seem ready to escape from the points where they reside and to enter everything passing within their range. The nanja tree where the spirit of an ancestor lives is sacred for the individual who considers himself the reincarnation of this ancestor. But every bird which alights upon this tree participates in this same nature, it is also forbidden to touch it. We have already had occasion to show how simple contact with the chewinga is enough to sanctify men and things. It is also upon this principle of the contagiousness of sacredness that all the rites of consecration repose. The sanctity of the chewinga is so great that its action is even felt at a distance. It will be remembered how this extends not only to the cave where they are kept, but also to the whole surrounding district, to the animals who take refuge there, whom it is forbidden to kill, and to the plants which grow there, which must not be touched. A snake totem has its center at a place where there is a water hole. The sacred character of the totem is communicated to this place, to the water hole and even to the water itself, which is forbidden to all the members of the totemic group. The initiate lives in an atmosphere charged with religiousness, and it is as though he were impregnated with it himself. Consequently, all that he possesses and all that he touches is forbidden to the women, and withdrawn from their contact, even down to the bird he has struck with his stick, the kangaroo he has pierced with his lance, or the fish which has bit on his hook. But, on the other hand, the rites to which he is submitted and the things which have a part in them have a sanctity superior to his own. This sanctity is contagiously transmitted to everything which evokes the idea of one or the other. The tooth which has been knocked out of him is considered very holy. For this reason, he may not eat animals with prominent teeth, because they make him think of his own lost tooth. The ceremonies of the Ku-ringel terminate with the ritual washing. Aquatic birds are forbidden to the neophyte because they make him think of this rite. Animals that climb to the tops of trees are equally sacred for him, because they are too near to Daramalun, the god of the initiation, who lives in heaven. The soul of a dead man is a sacred thing. We have already seen how this same property passes to the corpse in which the soul resided, to the spot where this is buried, to the camp in which he lived when alive, and which is either destroyed or quitted, to the name he bore, to his wife and to his relations. They, too, are invested, as it were, with a sacred character. Consequently, men keep at a distance from them. They do not treat them as mere profane beings. In the societies observed by Dawson, their names, like that of the dead man, cannot be pronounced during the period of mourning. Certain animals which he ate may also be prohibited. This contagiousness of sacredness is too well known a phenomenon to require any proof of its existence from numerous examples. We only wish to show that it is as true in totemism as in the more advanced religions. When once established, it quickly explains the extreme rigor of the interdicts separating the sacred from the profane. Since, in virtue of this extraordinary power of expansion, the slightest contact, the least proximity, either material or simply moral, suffices to draw religious forces out of their domain, and since, on the other hand, they cannot leave it without contradicting their nature, a whole system of measures is indispensable for maintaining the two worlds at a respectful distance from one another. This is why it is forbidden to the profane, not only to touch, but even to see or hear that which is sacred, and why these two sorts of life cannot be mixed in their consciousnesses. Precautions are necessary to keep them apart because, though opposing one another, they tend to confuse themselves into one another. When we understand the multiplicity of these interdicts, we also understand the way in which they operate and the sanctions which are attached to them. Owing to the contagiousness inherent in all that is sacred, a profane being cannot violate an interdict without having the religious force, to which he has unduly approached, extend itself over him and establish its empire over him. But as there is an antagonism between them, he becomes dependent upon a hostile power, whose hostility cannot fail to manifest itself in the form of violent reactions which tend to destroy him. This is why sickness or death are considered the natural consequences of every transgression of this sort, and they are consequences which are believed to come by themselves, with a sort of physical necessity. The guilty man feels himself attacked by a force which dominates him and against which he is powerless. Has he eaten the totemic animal? Then he feels it penetrating him and gnawing at his vitals. He lies down on the ground and awaits death. Every profanation implies a consecration, but one which is dreadful, both for the subject consecrated and for those who approach him. It is the consequences of this consecration which sanction, in part, the interdict. It should be noticed that this explanation of the interdicts does not depend upon the variable symbols by the aid of which religious forces are conceived. It matters little whether these are conceived as anonymous and impersonal energies or figured as personalities endowed with consciousness and feeling. In the former case, of course, they are believed to react against profaning transgressions in an automatic and unconscious manner, while in the latter case, they are thought to obey passionate movements determined by the offense resented. But at bottom, these two conceptions, which, moreover, have the same practical effect, only express one and the same psychic mechanism in two different languages. The basis of both is the antagonism of the sacred and the profane, combined with the remarkable aptitude of the former for spreading over to the latter. Now this antagonism and this contagiousness act in the same way, whether the sacred character is attributed to blind forces or to conscious ones. Thus, so far is it from being true that the real religious life commences only where there are mythical personalities, that we see that in this case the rite remains the same, whether the religious beings are personified or not. This is a statement which we shall have occasion to repeat in each of the chapters which follow. But if this contagiousness of sacredness helps to explain the system of interdicts, how is it to be explained itself? Some have tried to explain it with the well-known laws of the association of ideas. The sentiments inspired in us by a person or a thing spread contagiously from the idea of this thing or person to the representations associated with it, and thence to the objects which these representations express. So the respect which we have for a sacred being is communicated to everything touching this being, or resembling it, or recalling it. Of course, a cultivated man is not deceived by these associations. He knows that these derived emotions are due to mere plays of the images and to entirely mental combinations, so he does not give way to the superstitions which these illusions tend to bring about. But they say that the primitive naively objectifies his impressions, without criticizing them. Does something inspire a reverential fear in him? He concludes that an august and redoubtable force really resides in it, so he keeps at a distance from this thing and treats it as though it were sacred, even though it has no right to this title. But whoever says this forgets that the most primitive religions are not the only ones which have attributed this power of propagation to the sacred character. Even in the most recent cults, there is a group of rites which repose upon this principle. Does not every consecration by means of anointing or washing consist in transferring into a profane object the sanctifying virtues of a sacred one? Yet it is difficult to regard an enlightened Catholic of today as a sort of retarded savage who continues to be deceived by his associations of ideas, while nothing in the nature of things explains or justifies these ways of thinking. Moreover, it is quite arbitrarily that they attribute to the primitive this tendency to objectify blindly all his emotions. In his ordinary life, and in the details of his lay occupations, he does not impute the properties of one thing to its neighbors, or vice versa. If he is less careful than we are about clarity and distinction, still it is far from true that he has some vague, deplorable aptitude for jumbling and confusing everything. Religious thought alone has a marked leaning towards these sorts of confusions. So it is in something special to the nature of religious things, and not in the general laws of the human intelligence, that the origin of these predispositions is to be sought. When a force or property seems to be an integral part or constituent element of the subject in which it resides, we cannot easily imagine its detaching itself and going elsewhere. A body is defined by its mass and its atomic composition, so we do not think that it could communicate any of these distinctive characteristics by means of contact. But, on the other hand, if we are dealing with a force which has penetrated the body from without, since nothing attaches it there and since it is foreign to the body, there is nothing inconceivable in its escaping again. Thus the heat or electricity which a body has received from some external source may be transmitted to the surrounding medium, and the mind readily accepts the possibility of this transmission. So the extreme facility with which religious forces spread out and diffuse themselves has nothing surprising about it, if they are generally thought of as outside of the beings in which they reside. Now this is just what the theory we have proposed implies. In fact, they are only collective forces hypostatized, that is to say, moral forces. They are made up of the ideas and sentiments awakened in us by the spectacle of society, and not of sensations coming from the physical world. So they are not homogeneous with the visible things among which we place them. They may well take from these things the outward and material forms in which they are represented, but they owe none of their efficacy to them. They are not united by external bonds to the different supports upon which they alight, they have no roots there, according to an expression we have already used and which serves best for characterizing them, they are added to them. So there are no objects which are predestined to receive them, to the exclusion of all others, even the most insignificant and vulgar may do so. Accidental circumstances decide which are the chosen ones. The terms in which Codrington speaks of the mana should be borne in mind. It is a force, he says, which is not fixed in anything and can be conveyed in almost anything. Likewise, the Dakota of Miss Fletcher represented the Wakan as a sort of surrounding force which is always coming and going through the world, alighting here and there, but definitely fixing itself nowhere. Even the religious character inherent in men does not have a different character. There is certainly no other being in the world of experience which is closer to the very source of all religious life, none participates in it more directly, for it is in human consciousnesses that it is elaborated. Yet we know that the religious principle animating men, to wit, the soul, is partially external. But if religious forces have a place of their own nowhere, their mobility is easily explained. Since nothing attaches them to the things in which we localize them, it is natural that they should escape on the slightest contact, in spite of themselves, so to speak, and that they should spread afar. Their intensity incites them to this spreading, which everything favors. This is why the soul itself, though holding to the body by very personal bonds, is constantly threatening to leave it, All the apertures and pores of the body are just so many ways by which it tends to spread and diffuse itself into the outside. But we shall account for this phenomenon which we are trying to understand, still better if, instead of considering the notion of religious forces as it is when completely formulated, we go back to the mental process from which it results. We have seen, in fact, that the sacred character of a being does not rest in any of its intrinsic attributes. It is not because the totemic animal has a certain aspect or property that it inspires religious sentiments. These result from causes wholly foreign to the nature of the object upon which they fix themselves. What constitutes them are the impressions of comfort and dependence which the action of the society provokes in the mind. Of themselves, these emotions are not attached to the idea of any particular object, but as these emotions exist and are especially intense, they are also eminently contagious. So they make a stain of oil, they extend to all the other mental states which occupy the mind, they penetrate and contaminate those representations especially in which are expressed the various objects which the man had in his hands or before his eyes at the moment, the totemic designs covering his body, the bull roarers which he was making roar, the rocks surrounding him, the ground under his feet, etc. It is thus that the objects themselves get a religious value which is really not inherent in them but is conferred from without. So the contagion is not a sort of secondary process by which sacredness is propagated, after it has once been acquired, it is the very process by which it is acquired. It is by contagion that it establishes itself. We should not be surprised, therefore, if it transmits itself contagiously. What makes its reality is a special emotion. If it attaches itself to some object, it is because this emotion has found this object in its way. So it is natural that from this one it should spread to all those which it finds in its neighborhood, that is to say, to all those which any reason whatsoever, either material contiguity or mere similarity, has mentally connected with the first. Thus, the contagiousness of sacredness finds its explanation in the theory which we have proposed of religious forces, and by this very fact, it serves to confirm our theory. And, at the same time, it aids us in understanding a trait of primitive mentality to which we have already called the attention. We have seen the facility with which the primitive confuses kingdoms and identifies the most heterogeneous things, men, animals, plants, stars, etc. Now we see one of the causes which has contributed the most to facilitating these confusions. Since religious forces are eminently contagious, it is constantly happening that the same principle animates very different objects equally. It passes from some into others as the result of either a simple material proximity or of even a superficial similarity. It is thus that men, animals, plants, and rocks come to have the same totem, the men because they bear the name of the animals because they bring the totemic emblem to mind, the plants because they nourish these animals, the rocks because they mark the place where the ceremonies are celebrated. Now religious forces are therefore considered the source of all efficacy, so beings having one single religious principle ought to pass as having the same essence, and as differing from one another only in secondary characteristics. This is why it seemed quite natural to arrange them in a single category and to regard them as mere varieties of the same class, transmutable into one another. When this relation has been established, it makes the phenomena of contagion appear under a new aspect. Taken by themselves, they seem to be quite foreign to the logical life. Is their effect not to mix and confuse beings, in spite of their natural differences? But we have seen that these confusions and participation have played a role of the highest utility in logic. They have served to bind together things which sensation leaves apart from one another. So it is far from true that contagion, the source of these connections and confusions, is marked with that fundamental irrationality that one is inclined to attribute it at first. It has opened the way for the scientific explanations of the future.